The Métis are a distinct Indigenous people. Métis communities in Ontario emerged along waterways and fur trade routes before Canada was a country. These historic Métis communities, which persist to the present day, develop their own customs, traditions, and identities that are rooted in kinship, relationship to the land, and a distinctive culture and way of life.
After 140 years, we're hopeful that the government will honor our half-breed adhesion.
The honor of that promise made to the half-breed collective back in 1875 is still as relevant today as it was back in that time. And I think that what this community is struggling and seeking is justice of essentially saying those benefits and that promise needs to be fulfilled, but also needs to be modernized and reflected in how Canada operates today.
Voyageurs used lakes and rivers to travel into the Northwest to trade furs in the mid-18th century. One of the most important areas for them in the Northwest and for the fur trade was the Rainy River, Lake of the Woods area. And even after their contracts with the fur trade companies ended, many of these men stayed in the area. They had families with First Nations wives. We see their names appearing in the HBC logbooks in the early 1800s. 31st of October, 1817. Wind southeast with rain most part of the day. Sent MacDonald and Dudley down the river with a small keg of rum to Mr. Calder. 10th of October, 1817. Wind easterly with a little snow all day. John Linklater and Mr. Calder arrived in the evening with the wild oats. 23rd of September, 1823. Two men repairing an old canoe as I am obliged to send for this rice. Châtelain and Auger at the same.
My ancestors were voyageurs. They were traders. They worked at the Hudson Bay posts. George was an interpreter for the treaty. They were trappers. They were bush cutters. They were fishermen, people of the land.
They developed their own unique society. Identified as half-breeds, they were the Métis. They would be the middlemen between First Nations and Europeans. The half-breeds lived, worked, and traded together. They lived together, they were witnesses at each other's weddings, and stood as godparents for their children. They were connected as one people. This web of relationships stretched throughout the region, from Rat Portage to Hungry Hall to Fort Frances.
It's very clear that a significant, Fort Frances is a very significant Métis settlement, basically, to put it that way. And as I said, we have all that history.
They had their own way of life.
But there was always this singing and these songs and these dances, which I didn't know at the time. I thought these are just family things, but they were actually Métis types, songs and dances and jigging and guitar playing and fiddle playing. There would always be the music component and all. So this social, cultural, traditional aspect of what our family did, I now know was part of the Métis way of life and the Métis culture. So what does it mean? The Métis way of life is the life that my family has been living for generations, and it's a connection to the land that has gone back for generations, both in terms of survival, hunting, fishing, medicines.
This way of life would be tested when the government began to open the West for settlement. Government agents began negotiating treaties with the First Nations.
Treaty 3 is one of the key nation-building treaties within Canada. It was fundamental to Canada's western expansion. There was no way through to the Red River and building the Railway West without first coming through Treaty 3. And it is one of the most unique treaties of all of the historic treaties because it is the only one that has an adhesion by a Métis collective. The half-breeds of Rainy Lake and Rainy River adhered collectively as a group in 1875. That doesn't happen in any of the other historic treaties. Canada had a policy of bringing half-breeds into treaties as individuals, but never was a Métis group able to secure an adhesion, a collective adhesion, that like they did in Rainy Lake and Rainy River. And it is one of the unique aspects of this community, but it's also one of the unique aspects in the historic treaty-making process within Canada. There's no other historic treaty that has a collective adhesion of a half-breed community within it.
On September 12, 1875, Nicolas Chatelain signed the adhesion to the Treaty No. 3 on behalf of the half-breeds of Rainy River and Rainy Lake. The half-breeds were promised reserve lands, annuities, and presents in exchange for surrendering all claims, right, and title to the land.
The half-breed adhesion creates a relationship that is there forever. It is binding, it is a solemn commitment, it is fundamental to nation building within Canada. And if you remove the treaty, you remove the fundamental compact that underlies our nation. And of course, the treaties are forever. They are ongoing relationships. And this one is uniquely with a half-breed community that continues to this day. And flowing from that is the fiduciary relationship that gives rise to specific fiduciary duties and obligations, that the promises around the reserves, the promises around annuities, the promises around the same benefits that other Treaty 3 descendants have access to. And that is fundamental to the solemn compact, the constitutional promise that is embedded in the treaty.
But almost immediately the government would fail to honor its agreement. The half-breeds petitioned the government for what was owed. Nicolas Chatelain died without seeing the promise of the treaty fulfilled.
The Métis are a part of this land. Their history, names, relationships are tied to this land. You cannot separate this territory from Métis identity or Métis stories. In this era of reconciliation, what we're in the process of doing is telling those stories. Often those stories are rewritten through someone else's eyes or someone else's history. And Métis people who have been here since before Canada became Canada and before Ontario became Ontario are telling those stories and putting themselves back on the map that they've never been removed from, but often not been understood as a part of. And that unique Métis relationship that exists in this region is being told by Métis people today. It's not just about advancing a claim, it's about telling the truth about our history in this part of the country. And I think that Métis people want to share their stories and put those stories back on the map so others can see, but also so they can protect those stories for generations to come.
The half-breeds remain in the region. They would be instrumental in the development of the North. Their legacy can be seen and felt today. They are the Métis of Treaty 3.
My Métis ancestors were born in this area, lived in this area, have died in this area, and we're still in this area.